Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about The Outlaws. The Outlaws is an American action comedy that tells the story of Owen Browning, a bank manager who's about to marry the love of his life, Parker. As the big day draws near, they're both visited by Parker's parents, who've been mysteriously absent from her life for a few years. Shortly after this, Owen's bank is robbed by a pair known as the Ghost Bandits. As evidence mounts up, Owen begins to suspect his future in-laws are the culprits responsible for the robbery, and so he tries to solve the mystery behind them before any further hijinks occurs that could disrupt his wedding. I don't have much to say about this movie other than that I wasn't a big fan of it. I suppose it will appeal to the usual Happy Madison crowd with its slapstick antics and over-the-top nature, but for me it was too excessive. There is some fun with it here and there, but it mostly gets lost in a sea of boredom and cringe. Adam Devine's performance as Owen is pretty much the same as any other recent comedy he's done. It might come down to personal taste as to whether or not one enjoys his comedy, but for me, as far as this movie's concerned, it doesn't work. He's simply too obnoxious and silly to bother getting invested in. His dialogue isn't funny, the weird noises he makes aren't funny, and his prissy feminine demeanor is unoriginal and, you guessed it, not funny. He acts like a complete schmuck throughout the movie, something that even other characters comment on, and while I realize this behavior is done on purpose to show how he becomes more confident throughout the movie's story, that doesn't make him any less annoying. His fiancée Parker isn't much better by comparison. While she thankfully doesn't get involved in any ridiculousness, she also doesn't do much of anything else other than be the token wife character. It's a shame because Nina Dobrev does a good job with her character where she can, but her role in this movie is just so boring to watch. The relationship between her and Owen is just as uninspired as everything else, with Owen being the feminine type and Parker being the more masculine type, from what little we do see of her. For a movie that supposedly centers around an upcoming wedding, there's not much of an emphasis on the urgency behind it. Their dynamic is essentially a convenience to uphold everything else that happens in the movie. Because their relationship is essentially a glorified cliche though, everything else around it feels just as half-baked, with the exception of two characters that help to elevate the movie just a little bit. These two characters are Billy and Lily Mcdermott, respectively played by Pierce Brosnan and Ellen Barkin. Both of them save the movie from being a complete dumpster fire, as they inject a much-needed dose of personality to the movie's events, especially Brosnan, who I didn't expect to have such good comedy chops in this movie. They're still not exactly original, but Brosnan and Barkin make them feel less boring compared to everyone else. They're forced to engage in behaviors that go against their inner nature for the sake of pleasing their daughter, which is a lot of fun to see, and it's great to see them take control of the situation, unlike Owen, who spends most of his time goofing around. This being said, the whole mystery behind Billy and Lily is so obvious that it's not even a spoiler at this point. It's clear as day right from the get-go that these two are the ghost bandits who held up Owen's bank, yet for whatever reason, the movie drags on and on with revealing their true motives. The audience has to suffer through Owen's awful comedy and a poorly paced story for the majority of the movie's runtime. Even when one tries to focus on the mystery of it all it amounts to is a typical get-rich-quick scheme to pay off a bunch of thugs. It's about as bland can get. That's something else I have to mention, is just how strange the villain Rahan is. Apart from being cliche and how she gives a limited amount of time to the characters to obtain the money for Owen's in-laws' debts, I recognize her actress as Davy's mom in Never Have I Ever, and it's nice to see her in another role, but I just can't believe her in her role in this movie. I'm not saying Indians with Russian accents don't exist, but there's just something phony about her performance in this movie that I can't get behind. It's the most bog-standard Russian mafia plot one can imagine, and even that falls flat because of how unnecessarily over-the-top Rahan is, though that's definitely not the actress's fault. Everything about this movie is over-the-top in general, which leads me to talk about the comedy. I know there are people out there who like silly slapstick stuff, and honestly, I don't mind a little bit of it, but between the bad dialogue, the unlikable supporting characters, and the overuse of slapstick, for me, it all ended up being too much. Some of the dumb gags in this movie include Owen freaking out over his ass being touched, his parents openly talking about orgies in public, robbing a bank in a Shrek costume, and moaning with a mix of pleasure and pain to open up a bank vault. I really wish I was making that last part up. While the vast majority of scenes in this movie were far from hilarious, I'd be lying if I said there weren't a few parts here and there that at least made me chuckle a little bit. There's a scene where Owen is sneaking around to gather intel about his future in-laws, and he gets chased around by a horde of miniature pincher dogs. That was one of the few scenes in the movie that I did actually have a good laugh at. There's a lot of supporting characters in the movie to add to the comedy, but they don't really help it so much as make it worse. Owen's EMT cousin is an idiot, his parents are awkward and have an unhealthy obsession with Parker's line of work, and Michael Rooker's role as the FBI agent is completely wasted and reduced to being the lone cliché authority figure. On top of this, there's another cliche which I kind of mentioned earlier, in which Owen is this big wimp, while everyone else around him is more confident and self-assured. It'd be fine if the movie showed him growing and improving himself over time, but unfortunately it just doesn't happen. The action scenes did fare better than the comedy. Some of the CGI effects look iffy, but on the whole the action is fairly on point. It features a mix of gunfights, brawls, and even a car chase with a Wolf Mother track playing in the background for good measure. All of the action is way more fun than the comedy, but there's not much of it here, and what is there ultimately still ends up feeling cliche. I know I've said the word cliche a lot in this review, but that's really what this movie comes down to. Everything from its characters, to its plot, to its comedy is so banal and unoriginal that it's just not fun to watch. If it were a more mediocre movie, it would be more excusable, but as it is now, it's just plain forgettable. Overall, The Outlaws is a boring comedy that fails to generate much in laughs or entertainment value. If you like action comedies and you don't mind watching one that's overly silly, you might enjoy watching this, but for me this was an easy pass. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that'll find this more funnier than I did, but I simply don't see the appeal. It's just another subpar action comedy in premise that gets worse the longer it goes on. It shouldn't necessarily be outlawed, but it's definitely not something I go out of my way to see. What did you think about this movie? Did you enjoy how silly and over the top it was in scope, or were you annoyed by it too? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of The Outlaws. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part where next time I review the Spanish horror movie Bird Box Barcelona. Bye bye!